On a cold March morning in 1943, a German test pilot cracked open a fresh logbook, drew a breath he didn't quite trust, and eased the throttles of a captured four-engine giant forward. The airplane wore black crosses now, but everything else about it, its deep, deliberate rumble, its forest of gun barrels, its cockpit bristling with unfamiliar gauges, shouted a different language. The note he wrote that day would become a confession. If the Americans can build these by the hundreds, we have. Misread the war. By the end of this story, you'll see why that line wasn't fear. It was prophecy. Our tale starts months earlier, over occupied France. An American B-17F nicknamed Wolfhound lifted into the winter light on a mission to smash rail yards east of Paris. It flew in a tight box of flying fortresses, each one a hedgehog of 50 caliber guns watching every angle of the sky. Then the horizon erupted. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, cannon flashes like fistfuls of magnesium shoved into the day. Wolfhound took hits. One engine coughed and died. Another began to fade, trailing smoke like a black kite tail. The formation couldn't slow to protect a straggler without inviting slaughter. The pilot looked at the channel, at the maps to neutral airfields far away, and chose the only survivable path. Put her down. Right now. Right here. He skimmed low over fields near Melun. Gear up. 30 tons of wounded aluminum sliding to a halt in mud and grass. Ball turret scything a long furrow. The crew tumbling out with hands raised, alive, captured, and standing beside the most valuable intact machine the Germans had yet seized. Within hours, soldiers and engineers swarmed the bomber. Panels came off. Cameras clicked. Tape measures whispered across skin. They didn't see a wreck. They saw a revelation. 2 days later, patched and refueled, the fortress lifted again, this time under German hands, flanked by escorts and smothered in warning orders to every flak battery along the route. Do not shoot. Someone did anyway. The bomber arrived at the Luftwaffe's secret proving ground with fresh holes and a new mystique. There, for 3 long months, the airplane didn't fly. It lay open like a textbook, while technicians traced arteries of wire, bled hydraulic lines, weighed armor plates in their hands, and marveled at an industrial philosophy very unlike their own. They found standardized parts that snapped into place without hand-fitting, sub-assemblies designed to meet on jigs as if they'd grown together. Miles of tidy wiring loomed as if by one mind. Redundancy everywhere. Fuel, oxygen, controls, so that damage meant inconvenience, not death. Where German bombers often owed their existence to craftsmen with files and patience, this fortress told a different story. Build many, build fast, build consistent. Then came March 17th. The test pilot advanced the throttles, for radials answered with a smooth, human heartbeat. In the air, the bomber surprised him, stable, obedient. Even on fewer than 4 engines, it held formation like a cathedral on rails. It climbed into thin air where guns on the ground grew tired and inaccurate. What impressed most wasn't grace but stubbornness. An airplane that could lose pieces and keep its promise anyway. But the soul of the fortress lived in its guns. The F model on the ramp bristled with 9 Browning M2s. Later G models would sprout 13, but 9 was already enough to redraw tactics. Tail, top, waist, and that eerie crystal. Ball beneath, the Sperry turret. Knit their fire into a latticework you could almost see when the tracers lit. Attack from dead astern, and you met a river of lead funneled down your throat. Slide in from the beam and waist gunners. Top turret. Sometimes even the tail would rake you from 3 directions. Try the belly and the ball turret. Spinning, craning, never blinking. Weighted with what felt like permanent zero. Each position packed hundreds of rounds, and the belts glowed with tracers that carved neon geometry in the sky. Those streaks weren't just sighting aids. They were psychological warfare, turning courage into second thoughts. German fighter squadrons learned quickly that the old playbook, chase, sit behind, pour fire, was suicide. The new doctrine spread by memo, training film, and whispers. Hit the fortress from the front. A head-on pass gave the attacker seconds, terrifying, precious seconds, before collision. It targeted the one area early models defended least well, the nose. Execute it right, and a pilot could shred the cockpit and forward systems, then knife under or over and live to make another run. Execute it wrong, and you died in a midair collision or in a crossfire as you climbed away. For a time, the head-on pass worked, and then American crews arrived in B-17GS with a new, chin-mounted turret under the nose. Suddenly, those frontal lanes weren't empty any longer. The bombardier could walk a pair of 50s straight into an attacker's windscreen while cheek guns and the top turret added their own savage punctuation. The sky chest changed again. Some German pilots answered with steep diving angles from above, others with unguided rockets lobbed from beyond machine gun range. Rockets shook formations, sometimes broke them, but brought their own penalty in drag and danger. Meanwhile, the escort fighters grew longer legs, and the sanctuary of deep German airspace began to vanish. The captured fortress didn't live only in laboratories. It earned a new uniform and a new job with a clandestine unit that specialized in missions where deception and range mattered more than standardization. Painted dark, carrying German codes, it slipped into nights where radar and tired eyes might mark it friendly for just long enough. It could trail a stream of returning bombers, look like one of them, listen, photograph, vanish. It ferried people and packages where maps drew the future in pencil. The record is thin by design, but the machine served. It was not alone. Another downed fortress, intact enough to fly, belly landed in Denmark later that year. A German test pilot climbed in cold, no manual, no checkout, no second chances, and coaxed the stranger out of a farm field like he'd known it all his life. That was the other secret the fortress taught. It was hard to fly badly. Back at the test center, the math grew ugly. A single late-model B-17, guns blazing, could throw roughly 10,000 rounds per minute, about 160 heavy bullets every second, into the air immediately around it. Now multiply that by a squadron in formation, then by a group, then by the wing that stretched horizon to horizon when the weather cleared and the orders were to burn a city's steel bones. Interlocking fire meant an attacker often flew through a storm shot by dozens of gunners at once. Accuracy might be low for each gunner on his own, but the aggregation was merciless. Fighter pilots described hitting that wall of tracers and feeling their resolve peel back like paint in a blast furnace. Numbers kept carving their verdict. Analyses of combat film told German planners that bringing down a fortress from behind might require 20 solid 20mm hits, if they were the right hits. A typical loadout gave a pilot perhaps 520mm rounds in total across his cannons. That translated to one long run. Maybe two careful ones, and then home empty. The bomber didn't run out of bullets that quickly. And yet, for all the terror of the guns, that wasn't the part that broke confidence. The part that broke it wore overalls. Engineers studying the captured ship realized they were reverse engineering a factory more than an airplane. Standardized fasteners, straight panels with few compound curves, modular sections that distant plants could build in parallel and bolt together like furniture. This was engineering in service of throughput. The test memos asked the question no gun could silence. If one looks like this, how many more will there be next month? The answers arrived as production figures whispered through intelligence channels and confirmed by the reality overhead. American plants turned out B-17s by the tens of hundreds. One year, a single facility averaged more than a dozen fortresses per day. In total, more than 12,000 flying fortresses rolled into the war. The factories also poured out fighters by the 100,000, tanks by the tens of thousands, ammunition by what felt like geological strata, all while shipping across oceans and still delivering faster than opponents could destroy. Compare that to Germany's sole heavy bomber project, crippled by design compromises and chronic reliability nightmares. Compare tidy, jig-built modules to panels hammered into place by dwindling pools of skilled labor under air raid sirens. Compare a rotation system that sent veteran crews home to train the next wave, to a grim calculus that kept exhausted aces in cockpits, until luck or injury ran dry. The fortress's real armor wasn't aluminum. It was capacity. Even exhibitions meant to steel German resolve did the opposite. Lined up on the tarmac, captured Allied machines. Fortress, Liberator, Thunderbolt, Mustang, Lightning, British heavies and fast bombers told a single, uncomfortable story. Different philosophies, one outcome. precision where it mattered, pragmatism everywhere else, quality control that made spare parts interchangeable halfway around the planet, assembly lines that turned complexity into routine. The men who flew the captured fortresses learned every blind spot worth knowing. They practiced attack profiles on the test ship and briefed frontline squadrons. Some aces carved their names into the margins of impossible odds, downing bomber after bomber in frontal passes measured in heartbeats. But the climbing curve of American formations, box into armada, made individual brilliance a statistic rather than a solution. By the time the fortress named Hound met its end in the last spring of the war, the campaign it had helped decode was already beyond decoding. The arithmetic was done, and so the logbook entry on that first German test flight reads today like the opening line of a mystery whose culprit is hiding in plain sight. Gun barrels and armor plates made the headlines, but factories wrote the epilogue. The 50s kept crews alive long enough to reach targets. The formations made fighters think twice. Yet the decisive weapon was the system that designed, built, fueled, trained, and replaced at a tempo the other side could not match. You cannot shoot down a factory. You cannot outfly a conveyor belt. Tell me in the comments, which moment would you have feared most? The head-on pass measured in 2 seconds, or the silent certainty of a production line that never sleeps? And if you were in that glass nose, chin turret humming, would you hold your aim as a fighter filled your world? If this story kept you hooked, smash the like button and subscribe. New episodes are coming, and your support turns research into more frontline history. Share your theories below. I read every one. Step back into that hangar, where the captured fortress sat on trestles like a great animal at rest. Mechanics traced the oxygen lines with fingertips turned gray from graphite. An engineer lifted a circuit breaker, pressed, watched the tiny red flag disappear, and smiled at the idea that a blown line didn't mean a smoked fuse and a grounded mission. It meant push, reset, carry on. That small, stubborn detail told a big truth. This airplane was built to shrug off bad luck and keep moving. Out on the test range, a choreography took shape. The fortress flew straight and level, then jinked, then held steady while Messerschmitts came screaming past along scripted vectors. Cameras in. Chase planes captured the geometry of every pass. On the ground, analysts ran the film frame by frame, rulers tapping the screen, angles, closure rates, exposure windows measured in fractions of a heartbeat. The verdict landed with the same weight every time. The longer you linger near a fortress, the less of your future you possess. So the Luftwaffe changed the question. If you can't loiter, can you stab? Pilots learned to crest far ahead and above, roll in from 12 o'clock high, and commit to the collision course until instinct begged them to turn. Hold, fire, brake. The good ones made it look easy, slotting rounds through the thin glass of the nose, punching through the cockpit, severing the fortress's brain stem. The truth? It took nerve like a wire and training that only experience could buy. Experience that Germany was losing faster than it could mint. Crews inside the American bombers learned just as quickly. They named their ships, painted art on the noses, checked cowl flaps and gun heaters and oxygen masks, and turned their fear into checklists. The new chin turret under the nose put purpose to their defiance. The bombardier, eyes usually married to a bomb site, now had a pair of remote guns he could steer. With a fingertip cradle, smooth, almost gentle, while the navigator swung his cheek guns to cover the flanks. Head-on passes got expensive for attackers in a single season. Up above 25,000 feet, where breath turned to crystal and oil went thick, those formations flew like architecture, stacked, offset, interlocked. The combat box wasn't a shape. It was a promise each airplane made to the next. I will watch your blind spot while you watch mine. From the ground, the stream looked endless. From inside, it felt like the world had narrowed to the drumbeat of engines and the ritual of scanning sky. High left, high right, level right, 6 o'clock low, eyes never resting, hands never cold for long. In briefing rooms across Germany, the captured fortress became a teacher. Pilots filed past its open hatches, dropped into the ball turret to test the limits of traverse, leaned into the tail position to sight along the guns, and imagine a speck growing into a predator. Instructors pointed out the seams and the shadows. angles where the top turret couldn't quite depress, depressions the chin turret couldn't quite reach. They practiced approaches against the test ship again and again until muscle remembered what nerves sometimes forgot. And still, the arithmetic robbed the romance. A fighter might carry 500 rounds of 20mm cannon ammunition, lethal rounds, explosive, each one a small verdict. But against a fortress built to soak wounds, 20 real hits, not near. Misses, not fragments, hits, often meant a kill from the rear, at average hit rates. That translated to a single long run, 2 if you rationed bursts like a miser. Meanwhile, the bombers carried thousands of 50 caliber rounds, and they were never alone. Rocket attacks arrived, tubes slung under wings, angles plotted on clear drafting paper. Pilots loose salvos from beyond gun range, then broke hard and ran. Rockets were frightening in the same way hail is frightening. You don't negotiate with it. When they detonated inside a formation, the shock could crack discipline, push 2 airplanes into the same air, and turn precision into shrapnel. But rockets also slowed fighters, turned them heavy, and made them bright targets for long-legged escorts growing bolder by the month. The Mustang's arrival rewrote the map. So did the Thunderbolt's hunger for altitude and the Lightning's twin-engine menace. The distance to Berlin used to be a moat. Then it became a commute. The clandestine work of the captured fortress carried on in the margins, where history doesn't always sign its name. Night flights that threaded the seams of radar coverage. Long, cold legs across coastlines where controllers heard a familiar engine note, saw a familiar silhouette on a scope, and waited for a call sign that wouldn't come. Parachutes that bloomed briefly over dark fields, then vanished. Cameras clicking from altitudes where contrails drew chalk lines across the moon. It's tempting to overstate those missions. It's wiser to acknowledge them for what they were: quiet, clever, and ultimately insufficient against a tide measured in factories per river and shifts per city. Back at the test center, engineers kept pulling on threads that led away from the airplane and into American manufacturing. Rivet patterns implied jigs. Jigs implied repeatability. Repeatability implied speed. Fasteners matched across sections as if an invisible standardization manual ran the entire continent. Wiring looms wore numbered tags like library cards. Armor plates wrapped crew stations as if the design once began with a human silhouette and grew outward into metal. The overall message was simple and terrifying. This machine wasn't an outlier. It was a product, and a product can be multiplied. Meanwhile, the human cost never left the equation. Fortress crews watched friends spiral down trailing smoke, counted 10 parachutes, counted 9, waited for a 10th that didn't flower. German pilots landed with gunpowder in their mouths and the shakes in their hands, wiped oil from their canopies, and stared at holes in the wings big enough to frame the sky. Ground crews on both sides patched, replaced, inspected, and then watched their work roll to the runway again. The captured fortress taught tactics. The war taught humility. Listen to the radio calls on a day when the weather finally broke. Bandits 12 high. Angel 28. Bombs away. We've lost 2 from yellow. Tighten up. Boys, tighten up. That one's smoking, he's going down. I can't get my left mag to stabilize. Feathering 2. 2's feathered. Keep your eyes open. They'll come again from the nose. The language becomes its own geography. Altitude as address, bearing as warning, numbers as prayer. When the chin turret appeared, you could feel the tactical shift in those calls. Nose has it. Top turret adding. Cheek guns. Engaging. The head-on pass, once a terrifyingly efficient answer, lost some of its edge. Skilled pilots adapted, as skilled pilots do. Diving steeply from above where elevation limits pinched defensive traverse, or sliding under the nose where depression limits made it awkward to track. But adaptation at the tip of the spear could not fix what the shaft lacked: time, fuel, pilots, parts. By 1944, attrition wrote policy. The Luftwaffe's bench emptied faster than the front. Replacements arrived. Green, brave, and unready for a sky that didn't forgive inexperience. The Americans, by contrast, rotated crews home after grim quotas of missions. First 25, then 35, planting combat knowledge back into training fields until muscle memory spread like a learned language. Different philosophies, born of different realities. In the final winters, The captured fortresses still flew when they could. Some sat out on dispersal pads under camouflage nets that fooled no one. Others were cannibalized to keep one airworthy machine alive. Air raids found the airfields again and again. Fires walked through hangars. And the airplane that once landed softly in a French field, almost whole, almost innocent, met the same end as so many of its cousins, swallowed by a war that had learned to devour even its teachers. What remains, after the smoke clears and the archives fall quiet, is a chain of simple ideas linked into inevitability. Put enough guns on a bomber, and you can cross enemy air with better odds than the last generation enjoyed. Fly in formations designed like fortresses without walls, and you can turn many small arcs of fire into one continuous shield. Build your airplane like a product, and you make every repair faster, every replacement simpler, every training syllabus shorter. Then tie those airplanes to an economy that can grow while under strain, and you get a machine larger than any single airframe, a machine that turns steel and labor and fuel into outcomes. So let me ask you this. If you had to choose a seat for one mission, would you take the ball turret's glass globe with its perfect view and terrible confinement, the tail with its lonely horizon, the top turret with its panoramic duty, or the chin turret with the head-on weight of the world? Tell me why in the comments. And tell me which tactic you think truly tipped the balance. The head-on pass, the rocket salvo, or the escort fighter's long shadow. If this deep dive earned your watch, hit like and subscribe. It's a small click that lets me keep pulling on threads like this until the whole tapestry of the war reveals itself. Your thoughts fuel the next episode, so drop them below and let's dissect the sky together. Climb into the fortress with me for a single mission and feel how the airplane teaches you to think. The tail gunner is already strapped in, the world behind him a long tunnel with no end. He is the first to spot the enemy and the last to see the aftermath. The ball turret gunner curls into a glass planet where the horizon is a ring and the earth is a spinning coin. He knows that if the electricals fail, the hand crank will be the difference between being trapped and being 20 years older someday. Waist gunners stand at open windows that turn oxygen into knives, hands numb on charging handles, eyes dancing between tracer paths and the silhouette of a friend 3 ship lengths away. The top turret watches everything that isn't watched, swivel riding circles in the sky. Up front, the pilot and co-pilot are part conductor, part shepherd, part stubbornness. The bombardier breathes in a cathedral of glass. One hand on a miraculous sight, he both worships and distrusts. The other on a cradle that moves guns like thought. Checklist discipline isn't romance, but up here, it's love in its most practical form. Oxygen on. Interphone check. Gun heaters on. Ammo feeds clear. Oil temps steady. Feathering check. Turret traverse. Sight alignment. There's a ritual to every switch, and the ritual soothes. It gives courage a place to live that isn't your throat. The first flak burst looks beautiful, which is a wicked joke. A neat, black flower blooms below, and then the stem grows toward you. The box tightens. The pilot holds formation because leaving. The geometry is worse than staying in it. The interphone chat loses its jokes and becomes a metronome. High right. High right. Correction. High 12. Standby nose. Chin turret tracking. Top turret adding. The bomber is not one machine now. It is 9 opinions that somehow all agree. Across the lines, in briefing rooms that smell of coffee gone cold, German instructors unroll diagrams that were born inside the captured fortress. They point to arcs where gun depression ends and elevation begins, to wedges under the nose and above the tail where convergence thins, to places where a disciplined pilot can live for 2 seconds, no more, and still cash out in victories. They teach head-on passes the way a surgeon teaches an incision. Angle, depth, timing, withdrawal, the change. They cannot teach is the one inside a pilot's chest when the world turns into closing speed and the cockpit glass of the bomber fills your canopy like fate. That part, you learn alone. The rocket phase comes like a rumor and then a fashion. Racks bolt on. Weight follows, and the pre-flight walk-around includes a glance at tubes that promise rainstorms. Those rockets do not need to be accurate. They need to be disruptive. A single detonation inside the geometry of a box is like a thrown chair in a bar fight. Suddenly, everyone's watching the wrong thing. But escort fighters see the tubes from far away, and the pilots who carry them must plan their courage in smaller doses. Inside the fortress, the cold does tricks. Sweat freezes in collar seams. The glass makes a lens of the sun that warms nothing. You taste metal through rubber. You learn to speak in bearings and ranges. You learn that you can be terrified and useful at the same time. The airplane is loud but also full of small voices. The clack of a charging handle, the sigh of a regulator, the tiny applause of ice shattering off a window frame. Courage here sounds like a man saying copy in a very normal tone while tracing a diving speck with a sight he cleaned himself. And the sight, the famous one, drafted into hero stories, teaches its own humility. On the perfect day, with the perfect formation, with the winds behaving and the attack waves blunted, it can write geometry onto steel and rails and tank farms. On every other day, you use it as doctrine allows. The lead takes primary aim. The rest take the leader. Toggles fall by faith and formation as much as by optics. Precision is a team sport, and the team starts on a factory floor thousands of miles away. The captured fortress becomes a traveling lecture. At one exhibition, rows of Allied aircraft captured, coerced, or inherited stand wingtip to wingtip like ideas arguing without words. A slender British fast bomber that outruns luck, a bulldog of a fighter that looks like it was carved from an engine, a fin-tailed long-range escort whose real weapon is endurance, an American heavy with a belly turret that turns the underworld into owned space. Visitors walk past and see not just shapes but systems, interchangeable parts, finishes that look like they came from the same painter even when they did not, fasteners that match across types because someone wrote a standard and meant it. Back in the test hangar, an engineer runs a hand along a stringer and feels quality control with his fingertips. He notes that the panel line that didn't quite line up on the last block now does, and that tells him a story about feedback loops and revision cycles. He watches a crew swap a component in minutes because the designers decided long ago that a mechanic with cold hands would thank them later. Every answer he finds points to the same origin, decisions made for scale. That is the part that changes faces in briefings. Out on the runway, a different kind of briefing is happening. A ground crewman taps a chin turret skin with a gloved knuckle and listens for the sound that says it's fine. Another traces a bullet groove in a prop blade that somehow didn't grow into a crack. Someone else counts the last belts into the last cans and does the quiet math of odds. There's a reverence to it that isn't about flags. It's about sending something you care about into harm with the best chance you can give it. In the cockpit of a German test ship, there's a different reverence, the kind reserved for puzzles worth solving. The pilot straps in, finds the control harmony that feels foreign and then familiar. He cycles the props and they answer together, the governor's whispering agreements. He brings the throttles forward and the airplane says yes in a language he did not grow up speaking. Up there, he tries the single-engine drills and discovers that this stranger doesn't panic when 1/4 of its heart goes quiet. He trims, he notes, he lands and writes it down where others can learn it without risking what he risked. Professionalism is its own courage, but the professional sees the currents under the surface. He reads reports, production rates, shipping schedules, training throughput, and understands that even perfect tactics cannot outrun a tide. He teaches anyway, because men will fly tomorrow whether the tide favors them or not. He shows them the best way into a head-on pass, the cleanest way out, the places to avoid because the ball turret will make a grinder there. He tells them to shoot late rather than early and to commit or go home, because half measures are the most expensive kind of bravery. The fortress, for its part, doesn't hate. It simply performs. It flies with a serenity that doesn't match the noise it makes. It takes hits and converts them into procedures. It carries stories painted on its nose that mean nothing to anyone who wasn't there. It lands heavy and smells like hot oil and cordite and relief. It goes back out because that is the bargain. There is a point. Everyone feels it. When escorts stop arriving late and start arriving early, the radio calls change tone when long-range fighters appear where fathers and instructors swore they could not. Attrition tilts, slowly at first, then like weather changing. The box breathes a little easier. The attack waves grow fewer. The rockets come in smaller salvos. The factories that made the bombers are now aiming at their mirror images across the map. Rails snap like brittle bones. Oil burns like a season. Bridges take a second to fall and months to rebuild, and there are more seconds than months left. In this new arithmetic, the captured fortress still flies when it can. Some nights it slips into a returning stream, black on black, harvesting voices and habits, photographing the ghosts of contrails in moonlight. Sometimes it goes alone, where only error or indifference will notice it. Its usefulness is no longer decisive, but it is still useful. And in war, that is enough to draw lines on maps. The record of those missions is thin on purpose, but the hints are there. A parachute sighted where none should be, a curious silhouette on a scope that vanished into clutter, a coded message received by someone who never admits receiving it. By the last season, the test center does not look like a place that teaches. It looks like a place that remembers. Air raids have a way of turning hangars into photographs. Bent aluminum gleams as if determined to be beautiful one last time. A ground crewman stands with a clipboard and no airplanes, because habits outlive machines. Somewhere, a fortress that once wore stars, and then wore crosses, and then wore fire stops pretending to be anything and returns to metal. The lessons it carried do not vanish, but the reason for learning them has become historical rather than hopeful. Here is the part one promised at the start. The truth that made that first logbook entry feel like prophecy instead of fear. Guns can win minutes. Tactics can win hours. Factories win years. The fortress's genius wasn't only its armor rings and gun arcs and redundant systems. It was the way those features could be reproduced by the thousands and kept flying by people who learned quickly because the airplane was designed to be learned quickly. Everything about it said, "We intend to do this again tomorrow. So choose with me." Now that we've walked the length of this story, was the decisive invention the chin turret that closed the frontal gap, the combat box that turned individuals into a swarm, or the assembly line that made that swarm inevitable? Tell me in the comments which idea you think actually won the daylight war, and which detail from inside the airplane surprised you most. If this chapter made the past feel immediate, hit like and subscribe so we can keep digging into the machines, the men, and the math that decided history. Your insights sharpen the next episode. Drop them below, and let's argue the details like veterans at a reunion. Let's open the bomb bay doors, not to drop anything, but to look straight down into the logic of the war. In the bay, you can see the ribs and spars framing an argument. If you can keep this machine in the air long enough, in enough numbers, the steel and fuel below will become ideas instead of realities. Bridges stop being crossings and start being targets. Rail yards stop being junctions and start being choices. Repair or starve the front. The captured fortress taught its examiners that this logic didn't rely on perfection. It relied on repetition. Repetition was the true miracle, a jig in. Seattle aligned a spar in precisely the same way as a jig in Burbank. A wiring loom in Long Beach snapped into terminals that had been drilled by someone who never met the man twisting the wires. Training syllabi back in the States standardized not just maneuvers, but habits. What jokes crews told to keep their hands from shaking. What songs ground crews sang when torquing bolts. The Luftwaffe pilots studying the captured ship realized they weren't fighting airplanes. They were fighting sameness. Made powerful. Instructors turned that knowledge into survival. They stood in front of squadrons and said, "You will not beat the fortress by nibbling at its edges. You will beat it by timing. Head on, 2 seconds. Beam attacks, 1 pass only. Spend your ammunition like a miser, not a gambler." If you see the chin turret on a G model, adjust your dive angle by just enough degrees to fall into the gray between depression and elevation. Rockets? Use them to split formations, not to score direct hits. And above all, do not get greedy. A second pass is where ghosts get made. Inside the bomber stream, American crews were learning a parallel truth. Don't be a hero, be a teammate. The lead did the math. The rest did the trust. When the Norden sight sang its geometry to the bombardier in the lead ship, his toggle was everyone's cue. Dozens of bomb doors, then scores, clacked open along the stream like a zipper coming undone. It's romantic too. Imagine each bombardier painting his own bullseye into history. It's more accurate to say they painted together, and the picture endured. The captured fortress also hardened an uncomfortable lesson. Survival loved redundancy. If oxygen failed in one line, a crewman snaked a bypass. If a hydraulic pump died, A hand pump built forearms and bought minutes. If the interphone went out, prearranged taps traveled down aluminum like Morse code spoken by a cathedral. Designers had imagined failure step by step, and then imagined the fix. That is not optimism. That is respect for reality. Follow me into a German fighter cockpit on a clear sky day when the stakes feel personal. You've briefed the head-on pass 100 times on chalkboards. Now it's a moving picture, and you are in it. The fortress's nose is larger every breath. You resist the urge to fire early because training lives in your trigger finger. At 400 yards, the world is a tunnel. At 300, the chin turret blinks, a small flicker that means a human being you will never meet is doing everything right. At 200, you press, the cannons kick, and you pull. If you time it, you live. If you mistime it by a second, the top turret will rake your canopy with anger you can feel. You level out by instinct. You don't think in words until the horizon returns to being a line instead of a promise. You glance at your ammunition count and do the math of one more run versus the odds. And for a breath you hate the arithmetic more than the enemy. Now come back into the fortress with me as a crew patches itself midair. A waist gunner's feed jams. The assistant gunner slaps the belt, palms the links, clears the burr, and the gun coughs back into life. The radio operator tucks a quick note into his log that will become someone else's procedure. The pilot's left forearm burns. He realizes he's been gripping the yoke hard enough to bruise. He relaxes, finds the trim, and the ship flies herself for a few breaths, loyal even now. The bombardier's eye counts seconds to the IP, the initial point, where a stream becomes a vector. He feels the weight of the toggle in his hand like a confession. What made the captured fortress so potent as a teacher was not only what it revealed, but how it revealed it. Engineers learned that American design teams asked, before all else, how will a 19-year-old fix this? In gloves? In the cold? In 4 minutes? Pilots learned that American tactics asked, how do we make individual bravery less necessary, not more? Factories learned from their own mistakes in cycles measured in weeks, not years. The enemy could be better in a duel. The Americans were better at the season. At a demonstration day near the test center, senior officers walked past the B-17 to a line of other captured aircraft and came back to the same conclusion twice. Different airframes, same fingerprints, flush riveting, familiar labeling. Access panels cut with mechanics in mind. The idea that terrifies planners isn't the one-off wonder. It's the franchise. Every fortress on that ramp whispered, there are more of me than you have ours. This is why, late in the war, morale wasn't a straight line for either side. American crews knew the cost. Empty bunks, empty chairs in briefing rooms, and flew anyway because the system that sent them would also send them home if they survived long enough. German pilots knew the skill and felt it stretch thin because experience kept burning away faster than it could be replaced. The captured fortress didn't create that imbalance. It made it undeniable, and yet, within that imbalance, individuals still wrote feats that inspire respect regardless of uniform. A German ace-timed 3 frontal passes in a single mission with metronome discipline and landed with cannon barrels too hot to touch. An American pilot held a crippled ship in formation on 2 engines, feathered and firm. So the box kept its shape and the guns kept their chorus. A ground crew worked through a night of raids to roll a patched airplane into line at dawn because the man who flew her had trusted them yesterday. War is a system. Courage is a person. By spring of the final year, the test center's files on the fortress were complete in the way only a losing archive gets complete. Meticulous, thorough, and finally irrelevant to altering the outcome. The last entries read like a letter that knows the recipient won't answer. Performance envelopes charted, vulnerable zones noted, counter-tactics recommended, and, between the lines, we understand this machine, we do not outnumber it. So where does that leave us at the end of this mission? With a simple hierarchy, tactics save lives, technology shapes battles, industry decides wars. The captured fortress helped write all 3 sentences. It showed how to approach and survive, how to design for damage and redundancy, and how to turn blueprints into daily reality. When the test pilot penned his line in that logbook, if they can build these by the hundreds, he wasn't being poetic, he was being precise. Before we close the hatch, I want your verdict. Which single decision mattered most? Designing an airplane the average mechanic could fix fast, institutionalizing formation tactics that turned 9 guns into 90, or extending fighter range so the stream never felt alone. Drop your take in the comments, and tell me which crew position you'd choose for one ride and why. If this episode delivered, tap like and subscribe. It keeps this channel flying and lets me bring you more missions where machines, men, and math meet in the sky. Your comments shape what comes next, so weigh in. I'll be in there with you. There's a rare silence that sometimes settles over a formation, the kind that arrives between attack waves when everyone is either reloading, reframing, or reconsidering. In that hush you hear the airplane's true voice, the slow, even conversation of 4 engines holding hands across distance. You hear the skins flex as the cold gnaws, the faint clatter of a loose pen cap in a map pocket, a breath being measured before it fogs a mask. In those seconds, the fortress feels less like a weapon and more like a promise kept under impossible conditions. Then the next wave forms on the horizon and the promise has to work again. Back at the test field, the promise was measured with calipers. One team mapped the oxygen system like a subway diagram, every valve station, every line a route with a detour if a bomb crater took out the main. Another team weighed armor plates and charted angles, discovering that protection wasn't just thickness, it was placement. Engineers ran their palms along the edges of access panels and realized how many decisions had been made for the person with cold fingers and limited time. They wrote up notes that read like compliments they didn't want to admit were compliments. Pilots translated those notes into tactics. Attack envelopes narrowed to tiny windows of probability. If you cannot be accurate, be brief, became a rule. The longer a fighter stayed near a fortress, the more the future shrank around him. Slashing attacks replaced dogged pursuit. Discipline replaced bravado. 1 pass, maybe 2, then home. Because ammunition isn't courage and courage isn't armor. Inside the bomber, discipline felt like ritual. A gunner counted tracers in his own stream to judge range, then adjusted by instinct taught through cold mornings on a gunnery range far away. The radio operator rode the nets, catching fragments of other fights, other boxes, stitching them into a picture for the pilot that no single pair of eyes could hold. The navigator's pencil tapped time into space, turning wind into math and math into course. The bombardier, whose instrument was both a lens and an argument, let the airplanes vibrations settle in his ribs so he knew when the geometry was true enough to matter. When escorts arrived deep, the formation exhaled in unison. Clouds of vapor trailed from exhaust stacks like a second set of contrails. The fighters slid along the stream like shepherds who knew each sheep by name. You could see the change in attacking pilots. Fewer straight-line commitments, more feints, more caution. The war of seconds tilted. In the shadows of this tilt, the captured fortress flew errands. That didn't make newspapers. It drifted at the edges of bomber streams, close enough to listen, far enough to be mistaken. It crossed coastlines at odd hours and odd altitudes, a silhouette so familiar it could hide in plain sight. It ferried people whose names never entered histories on pages you can buy. It dropped packages whose impact was measured not in craters, but in meetings held weeks later behind doors that locked from both sides. Every mission was a narrow bridge over a very real fall. The logbooks spoke in codes and brevity. Time off, fuel on, return made, no questions. But even cleverness accumulates fatigue. Each sortie wore grooves into airframes that no maintenance schedule could fully erase. Each raid on the test center carved another note into the margin. Parts missing, spares low, personnel scattered. The archive thickened while the runway thinned. There was, along the way, an exhibition day that felt almost like a museum survived its own subject. Captured aircraft lined the apron, sleek, squat, twin-boomed, broad-winged. Each a sentence in a conversation about how nations solve the same problem differently. The fortress stood there too, not the newest, not the fastest, but the one that looked as if it had been designed by people who started with a checklist and built outward. Visitors put hands on metal and came away with an idea that's hard to shake. Excellence is not always a miracle. Sometimes it's a habit. Out in the sky, that habit looked like resilience. A fortress could fly with 1 engine out and 2 sulking. It could carry wounds like souvenirs and still hold formation. It could land ugly and live to fly beautiful. Crews learned to trust the airplane the way you trust a friend who has never once left you at the worst moment. And that trust was practical, not poetic. It tightened formations, steadied hands, shortened the distance between terror and procedure. German instructors, standing by blackboards dense with arcs and angles, taught the best answers possible for men expected to meet a system with skill. They diagrammed approach vectors that slid between fields of fire like a seamstress threading a needle. They rehearsed dives from oblique angles where gun elevation limits bit and taught breakaways timed to the heartbeat. They reminded pilots, if you feel the urge to fire early, you are already late. If you feel safe, you are already wrong. The training saved lives. The training did not change the calendar, because the calendar belonged to the factories. That was the truth that reached into every briefing room like winter air under a door. A production line does not fight you today. It fights you tomorrow, and then again the day after, until your courage has to pass its own endurance test. The captured fortress became a Rosetta Stone for that idea. Inspect a wiring loom, and you decode distribution, measure a panel fit, and you translate quality control, time a component swap, and you understand why one side's machines go back into the sky after lunch while the others wait until next week. There's a story from a cold morning near the end. A ground crew rolled a damaged fortress into a hangar battered by raids. The doors groaned like ships. The power flickered. The crew chief carried a box of salvaged parts that looked like the last pennies in a purse. They worked in coats and gloves, breath pluming, using procedures invented by designers who had imagined this exact moment. They did not finish everything on the list. They finished enough. At dawn, the airplane taxied out, hesitant in the snow, then lifted, and the men on the ground watched it go with the same mixture of pride and worry they'd felt 100 times. They turned back to the hangar and made coffee that tasted like metal, and one of them said, again, like a prayer. In a different hangar, someone closed a file on the captured ship and wrote a line that meant more than the ink it cost. Evaluation complete. That didn't mean the airplane had no more to teach. It meant they had learned all that mattered and still could not bend the war spine with it. You could see the acceptance in the economy of words, fewer adjectives, more numbers, less hope disguised as analysis. The final flights felt like epilogues. The captured fortress wore paint meant for night and carried codes that lied politely. It crossed paths with ghosts it once escorted or attacked. Somewhere in that last spring, an air raid found the field where it slept. Fire erased its serials and its secrets with the same efficiency. The wreckage glinted in morning light. Already an exhibit, already a lesson. Knowing is not the same as having. The bigger lesson survives if you let it. War runs on 3 clocks. The second hand belongs to tactics, the head-on pass, the jink, the break, the minute. Hand belongs to technology, the chin turret, the computing site, the self-sealing tank. The hour hand belongs to industry, standards, training pipelines, logistics that do not care how late it is because they are never tired. You can win seconds with nerve and minutes with ingenuity. You win hours with factories. Hours become days. Days become outcomes. The fortress stitched those clocks together. It gave gunners chances, pilots margins, and planners proof that design can be merciful. It showed opponents where courage turns into waste and where discipline turns into survival. It proved that the most compassionate thing you can build for a 19-year-old in a leather jacket is not a miracle machine, but a dependable one. So let's end where we began, in a cockpit where a test pilot wrote a single line that sounded like a prophecy. He wasn't surrendering. He was diagnosing. He understood that some wars are decided not by who learns the most secrets, but by who turns the most wrenches, who ships the most crates, who standardizes the most bolts. That doesn't diminish bravery. It explains its purpose. Courage is how you spend the lives you cannot save with planning. Now it's your turn to judge the evidence. Tell me in the comments which choice you would write into the blueprint of every future machine. The redundancy that forgives failure, the formation that converts individuals into a shield, or the production philosophy that turns a good design into 1,000 good airplanes. And if you had one question for the crew chief who kept a battered ship alive through a winter of shortages, what would you ask first? If this journey gave you new angles on familiar history, hit like and subscribe. It keeps this channel aloft and tells the algorithm that you want more stories where engineering, endurance, and human grit meet above the clouds. Share your take below. I'll be reading, debating, and building the next mission from your best ideas. Picture a debriefing room after a raid. Maps rolled halfway, chalk dust in the air, coffee gone to mud in enamel mugs. The men who return don't swagger. They sit and listen. The intelligence officer pins a photograph to the board, tracks like veins, factories like organs, and draws circles where explosions turn certainty into questions. Then he holds up a recovered fragment, aluminum torn like paper, and says, "This is ours." And everyone understands both the pride and the price. The fortress teaches even when it bleeds. Across the lines, a different debriefing. A German instructor draws an ellipse on a blackboard and fills it with slashes, the arcs of dorsal and tail fire, the drag of tracers that bend courage. He sketches a line from 12 o'clock high and marks a tiny window where probability lives. Hold, fire, break. He reminds the room that rockets should be thunder rather than lightning. Disrupt, don't duel. He tells young pilots that the most dangerous instinct is to stay for a second pass. Their silences, a scent mixed with dread. Walk the length of the captured fortress again, and you'll feel the design arguing with fear. Armor where hands and heads must live. Clear fields for gunners. Not because romance likes gunfights, but because reality does. Circuit breakers that forgive mistakes. Panels that open like doors you've walked through before. It is an airplane that expects the worst and makes it manageable. In one test, pilots flew alongside the fortress and filmed its gun arcs as if they could turn bullets into geometry and geometry into immunity. In the footage, when you slow it down, you can see the spaces between the lattices of fire, the seams where fortune and precision make a narrow hallway. Tactics were born there, in inches nobody notices at full speed. It's no wonder the best German aces became obsessive about angles and timing. Survival lived in arithmetic. Meanwhile, crews inside the bomber turned arithmetic into habit. Waist gunners counted tracers in multiples, reading their own streams like musicians read bars. The ball gunner tracked through full circles, judging closure by how fast the rivets on a fighter's wing rolled past his sight. Tail gunners learned to feel distance by the time it took a speck to grow teeth. The radio man built a map from voices, bearing, altitude, panic level, then offered calm where he could. The navigator's pencil ticked across the chart like a heartbeat. The pilot held formation with fingertip pressure and a refusal to flinch. The chin turret added something else. A moral to the lesson about learning. It existed because crews bled and wrote letters upward, reports that said, plainly, "This is where we die most." Designers answered with metal and motors. When that turret first hummed under a nose, you could measure the new math of the sky in the way head-on attackers hesitated. Improvement wasn't a miracle. It was listening with a wrench in your hand. The clandestine life of the captured fortress continued in the seams of the war. It threaded return routes like a shadow, learning the dialect of radio discipline, the cadence of check-ins, the moments where fatigue made voices soft. On other nights it flew far where charts greened into unknowns, dropped men who stepped into stories without titles, picked up messages that would read like riddles for decades. If you ask the war what these missions meant, it will shrug and hand you two truths. Some mattered more than anyone knew. None moved the calendar. At the test center, engineers began writing in a tone that gave away the future. Less wonder, more bookkeeping, less why and more how fast. They still admired the airplane, still learned from it. But the awe had cooled into a professional respect tinged with resignation. The fortress was no longer a revelation. It was a pattern. Patterns crush improvisation. That is the quiet horror the captured ship made visible. Even brilliant pilots cannot fly more sorties than factories can replace airframes. Even perfect tactics cannot erase a training pipeline that turns teenagers into operators with checklists stamped into their bones. The test team understood this without sentiment. They were craftsmen and scientists. They loved excellence as a virtue. They simply counted, and the count did not love them back. Let's put you in two cockpits at once for a single instant. The strange empathy this story demands. In the German fighter at the top of the curve, you roll into the sun and hold your breath at. The moment the fortress's nose fills your world, you are the sharpest version of yourself. Patient, disciplined, unsentimental. You fire late because early is waste. The world flashes and you break with a violence that feels like life itself. You live. You have ammunition for one more pass. You glance to see if your wingman still exists and promise yourself you won't press luck. In the fortress, the bombardier watched that same flash through curved plexiglass and felt the chin turret chatter. Under his palms, a vibration that travels into the bones. The pilot's eyes never left the lead ship. The top turret stitched a warning into the blue. The ball gunner exhaled and rechecked his arc because he knows a second fighter will often arrive 2 heartbeats after the first. The ship took a hit and stayed an airplane. Procedure devoured panic. That is design doing its highest job. By late in the war, exhibitions of captured machines felt like elegies to curiosity. Visitors still traced panel lines with cold fingers and admired how fasteners matched across variants. They still knelt to see the ball turret's cramped perfection. They still nodded at the ease with which a component could be swapped. But the illusions were gone. Everyone understood they were looking at the visible grammar of an invisible language: standardization, scale, supply. Back at battered airfields, ground crews became priests of persistence. They could lift a wounded engine cowling with the rhythm of a ritual. They measured prop pitch by feel and habit. They learned to scavenge parts without compromising safety, because there are corners you cannot cut when lives sit 3 feet away. They watched their ships lift into thin, bright mornings and felt the paradox that defines their calling. The pride of a job done right and the helplessness of handing it to fate. Then the endgame arrived like weather. Long-range escorts turned myth into routine. Rocket racks were left behind more often because drag was suicide. Attack waves thinned. Bombs wrote their long argument across oil and rail and steel. And that argument started to persuade even those who had sworn never to listen. In the test center's files, the last memos on the fortress read like completions, not breakthroughs. The airplane had finished teaching. The calendar had taken over. One last image. The captured fortress sleeps under camouflage netting that fools no one. Snow scabbing the wings, paint dull with winter. Sirens draw a line through the morning. The first explosions step across the airfield like giants with bad tempers. Afterward, the wreckage is almost elegant, an anatomy diagram laid open by fire. A mechanic picks his way through and stops at a circuit breaker panel. Charred, half-melted, and for reasons he could never explain. He presses a blackened button. Nothing happens. He laughs, a short breath in cold air, at the reflex. That's what the airplane did to people. It taught them that trying again was sensible. And here is where we land the story. Not with a flourish, but with a hierarchy you can carry into every other chapter of this war and all the ones that came after. Tactics wins seconds. Technology wins minutes. Industry wins hours. And hours decide wars. The fortress mattered because it connected all 3 clocks. It gave seconds to gunners when seconds were everything, minutes to formations when minutes changed targets, and proof to planners that hours could be manufactured. So tell me in the comments, if you were designing a machine for 19-year-olds to trust with their lives, what's the first feature you'd insist on? Redundancy that forgives mistakes, access that speeds repairs, or ergonomics that make right actions easy under stress? And if you had to argue that one idea, standardization, formation doctrine, or escort range, was the real turning point in daylight bombing, which case would you make? If this episode earned your attention, hit like and subscribe. It turns research into the next mission and keeps this channel flying. Share your insights below. I'm in the comments, reading, debating, and building the next story from the sharpest points you bring. There's a lesson in how the fortress carried memory, crews rotated home, and taught. Ground chiefs kept notebooks thick with fixes and field tricks. Designers fed battle reports back into drawings that moved holes, added armor, shaved minutes from tasks nobody sees, but everybody relies on. The airplane was not a frozen idea. It was a conversation that learned. The captured fortress made that visible to the men who studied it in secret. They weren't just confronting a machine. They were confronting a feedback loop. That loop extended to how formations lived. A lead crew might change a climb schedule by 2 minutes, and 100 airplanes breathed easier through flak they would have hit before. A group altered spacing by a wingspan, and suddenly gunners saw more sky and less friendly aluminum. Small decisions, multiplied, softened edges that used to cut. Opponents noticed. Attack windows shrank without anyone declaring it so. You can feel the difference in the way crews wrote about the work. Early entries overflowed with surprise. How cold felt like glass. How tracers stitched the air like wire. How a misset mixture could hobble an engine. Later entries read like field guides. Expect frontal attacks first, then slashing from high 2 o'clock. Watch for rocket racks at distance. Mind the chin turret's power draw in extreme cold. Rotate gunners on long legs to keep eyes fresh. Familiarity did not breed contempt. It bred competence. Competence, in turn, made courage practical. A waist gunner who knows his feed tray by touch won't panic when a link flips. A pilot who trusts the trim won't fight the yoke into fatigue. A bombardier who has rehearsed abort criteria won't force a bad drop for pride. The airplane rewarded that maturity with survivability, and survivors became teachers. The system kept bettering itself because people lived long enough to improve it. Across the line, the best German squadrons tried to build their own loop under harsher constraints. Aces briefed rookies with unforgiving clarity. Approach fast, fire late, waste nothing, and never let the fortress turn you into a target by making you feel brave. They ran gunnery sims with the captured ship, walked new pilots through its interior to teach empathy as tactic. Know the enemy's posture, and you'll know where his eyes are not. It helped. It could not overcome the math. And still, in the cracks of all this arithmetic, the human keeps showing. A pilot tapes a photograph to the panel and swears it makes the altimeter steadier. A ground crewman writes a tiny tally. On the inside of a wheel well, flats changed in weather no one would choose. A radio operator composes a letter in his head to the mother of a friend who didn't come back and discovers he cannot finish the first sentence. The fortress is a tool. The people remain the point. The captured airplane also made clear the difference between spectacle and effect. Rockets looked terrifying on film. Their shockwaves made crews flinch. But the Ledger preferred the steady work of escort fighters and disciplined formations. A head-on pass looked heroic in drawings. The Ledger favored the quiet utility of a chin turret that robbed that heroism of its advantage. Precision bombsight lore made for glorious headlines. The Ledger rewarded the boring excellence of standardized maintenance that put more airplanes over target more often. War respects reliability. Reliability had a geography. Factories far from the front ran on rivers and rails that weren't shelled daily. Training bases sprawled where weather taught lessons without punishment. Ports pulsed with a rhythm that turned tonnage into routine. None of this makes for a dramatic poster. All of it makes for outcomes. The captured fortress taught its examiners to read these maps in the grain of a panel and the stamp on a circuit breaker. By late in the story, even Flak seemed to acknowledge the change. Those black flowers still climbed, but formations adjusted altitude and timing. Escorts harried batteries on the way out and repair. Crews learned to read the pattern of hits the way sailors read a sea. The sky never grew safe. It grew survivable for the side that could turn lessons into procedure before the next mission. There is a kind of grace in watching a machine fulfill its purpose without pretending it loves it. The fortress would launch into mornings that felt like polished steel, take its burns and dents, and return with the uncomplaining dignity of a tool used hard and well. Crews anthropomorphized it. Of course they did. But what they were really praising was the mercy of good design. Levers where hands expected them, panels that opened without swearing, systems that failed politely instead of catastrophically. At war's end, some fortresses found their way to museums and airshows. Polished, they gleam in summer light, and children look up into the bomb bay as if it were a vault in a cathedral. Veterans put a palm on a rib and close their eyes and remember the sound their bones still know. The captured airplane will not stand next to them. It burned in a spring raid near the end, but the knowledge it carried survived it, the way a good book survives the library that first shelved it. What should we take from that? That excellence scales only when you design it too. That feedback is a strategy, not an afterthought. That standardization isn't the enemy of ingenuity. It's the ground that lets ingenuity stand up straight. That tactics thrive inside good ergonomics, and bravery thrives inside sane procedure. Bring it down to earth. If you were building anything for hard days, a hospital protocol, a wildfire response plan, a seaborne convoy, a code base for critical systems, you'd want what the fortress had: clear access, redundancy that assumes failure will arrive, interfaces that forgive stress, training that turns fear into checklists, a culture that reads the debrief and changes the next brief accordingly. The airplane's lesson is not locked in 1943. It breathes wherever people must be both fragile and effective. So when that German test pilot wrote, "If they can build these by the hundreds," he meant more than airframes. He meant, if they can build the conditions for excellence at scale, the rest of us are counting bravery while they are counting throughput. He respected the machine because he respected the thinking that made it possible. He knew the war's end was embedded in that thinking long before anyone signed papers in a ruined city. Let me hand this back to you. Which of the fortress's virtues feels most modern to you? The repairability that anticipates failure, the doctrine that turns individuals into a team, or the feedback loop that never stops upgrading the system? And if you've seen one in person, what detail stuck with you? The cramped ball turret, the neat wiring looms, the bomb bay's stark honesty. If this finale landed for you, hit like and subscribe. It helps me keep telling the kinds of stories where machines reveal the people who built and used them. Drop your thoughts below. I'm in the comments, ready to argue, learn, and build the next mission from the sharpest ideas you bring. Walk into a maintenance bay at dawn and watch how victory is made out of ordinary motions. A crew chief rubs a thumb across a gasket to feel for grit. A spark plug tray sits arranged like a chessboard, gaps telling a story no one has to speak. Someone calls out torque values the way other people recite hymns. A gunner leans in, checks feed chutes by touch with eyes closed. Practice for the moment when seeing isn't possible. None of this looks heroic. All of it is. Follow the logistics chain backward, and you see the scaffolding that held the fortress aloft. A crate leaves a factory where a worker who has never tasted contrail cold stamps a part number that will matter to a teenager over the North Sea. A railcar rolls through a switchyard that will be a target tomorrow but isn't tonight. A dock crew cranes boxes into a ship whose wake points toward a war that will never meet them by name. When the crate finally opens under a hangar lamp, the part slides into place with a satisfying click because two strangers agreed on a standard months earlier. That click is strategy. The Luftwaffe engineers understood this in their bones by the end. They could respect it and still be defeated by it. They used the captured fortress to teach what could be taught. The seam between arcs where a fighter might live long enough to fire. The telltale glint that means a chin turret is tracking you. The way tracers bend at certain ranges because parallax is not a suggestion. Their memos were precise and unsentimental. Their conclusions were honest. Excellence at the tip cannot cancel scarcity at the base. Inside the bomber stream, excellence looked like monotony done well. The pilot trimmed out a shiver in the wing and felt the formation knit tighter. The navigator checked drift against a checkpoint that only he could see in his mind and shaved a mile off the error that would have put bombs where they didn't belong. The bombardier rehearsed the phrase, "no drop," under his breath because the bravest word in precision is sometimes abort. The radio man kept his voice level on a net filled with men who had reason not to be. Monotony saved lives. There were still days when nothing worked the way the manual promised. Icing crawled across leading edges like a slow disease. Prop governors argued with cold oil. Guns seized at the worst second and sprang back only after the threat had passed. On those days, the airplane's philosophy, fail soft, fail local, fail with a plan, paid back everything invested in it. A hydraulic line could be hand-pumped. A feathered prop could be unfeathered. An oxygen leak could be bypassed with a kit designed by someone who had once taken the same breathless gasp. That is design is empathy. The captured fortress also taught its examiners a subtler thing. The way culture shapes machines. The labels were plain and consistent. The checklists were written as if the author imagined stress in the reader's hands. The access panels opened as though someone had timed the operation and cared. None of that happens by accident. It happens when a program values the mechanic's time as much as the pilot's glamour. That value shows up as airplanes that go back up before the next weather front closes the window. In classroom films cut from gun cameras, you can see the moment when doctrine updates. Early reels show long, tempting rear quarter attacks that end in tracers walking up an attacker's spine. Later reels show slashing passes, short and surgical, or steep dives that exploit a turret's elevation limit for a heartbeat. The difference is not courage. It is discipline. It is a community deciding, together, to prefer survival over theater. The men in both camps built rituals to carry the weight. American crews named their ships not because paint scares bullets, but because identity steadies hands. German pilots chalked small marks on instrument panels where a certain sight picture meant now for the trigger because timing beats bravado. Ground crews on both sides touched metal for luck before a first flight after. Major work. Not because luck is a system, but because habit creates calm. At the edges of the war's map, the captured fortress continued to be a ghost with a job. It tucked into bomber streams like a remora, harvesting radio habits, then slid away before escorts came close enough to ask questions with guns. It flew odd corridors where a silhouette could be mistaken for a friend returning late. It carried passengers who stepped into darkness, trusting a rendezvous they would never be able to confirm. Some missions changed little, a few changed enough. None rewrote the tide. By late seasons, even the test center's tone changed. Reports closed with no further recommendations, more often than not. The airplane had been turned like a jewel in light from every angle. Its strengths were cataloged. Its seams were mapped. Its counters were trained. The remaining variable was the count. How many arrive today? How many tomorrow? How many after you sleep and wake again to the same sky? Theirs. A final paradox the fortress embodies. It was built to deal death, and yet everything about its interior is an argument for preserving life. Armor where heads will be. Redundant oxygen where breath will run thin. Circuit protection that forgives a mistake instead of punishing it forever. A layout that keeps a panicked hand from choosing the wrong lever. If you can hold two truths at once, that an airplane can be both weapon and mercy, you understand why crews love their machines without apology. After the war, the machines scattered, some to scrapping torches, some to quiet museums, a few to skies that now hold nostalgia instead of flak. The captured fortress left no artifact to touch, but its fingerprints remain wherever people do hard things systematically. In hospitals that rehearse failures before they happen. In code bases that assume outages and recover without drama. In wildland fire teams that rotate crews before exhaustion makes cowards out of heroes. The lesson is portable. Designed so the average day absorbs the bad moments without turning them into tragedies. So let's end with the question that sits under everything we've seen. If you could carry one principle from the fortress into your own work, whatever your war looks like, what would it be? Build for repair, not just performance. Train for teams, not just talents. Close the feedback loop every time, even when it stings. Tell me in the comments what you'd choose, and which moment in this story felt most human to you. If this journey gave you something worth thinking about, hit like and subscribe. It keeps this channel alive and lets me bring you more histories where machines reveal the people who make them matter.